Thank you, Mr. Jeffrey, and hello to everybody out there. Thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion today, and I look forward to the questions afterwards that we can have some meaningful debate. So, just to put context around what I'm talking about today is effective leadership, and specifically strategic leadership, and I'll define that shortly. So, effective, to my understanding, would be being able to achieve one's objectives, but also find meaning and personal growth in one's job. And again, I'll be talking about the strategic side. So obviously, each of us has our own areas of expertise. If I'm an accountant, financial manager, then I'm involved obviously in my own discipline. But when we lead effectively, then regardless of the area in which we work, we're able to achieve our strategic aims and help our company and our teams, most importantly our people, achieve as well. And I'm going to keep coming back to saying also to have a meaningful and find engagement in our positions. So, as you would have seen, these are the topics that I'm going to be covering today. So the first one is looking at the critical components that strategic leaders need to show. And then one of the key things that we find in many organizations is we set our strategies, we set these goals, and yet the day-to-day realities, the operational pressures get into our way. And so we tend to lose focus. There's another way of putting that. We focus on the urgent, but we lose sight often of the important things for the long term. And then to pull that all together, there's a one-page model or a dashboard, possibly one could call it, that helps leaders keep themselves and their teams focused on the right things. And if we know what we should be doing, it helps us not do the things we shouldn't be doing. And so we'll spend some time on that, and I would hope and expect that that would be of value for you that you could use right away. And then finally, what I'll be doing is looking at some of the things that we can't avoid along the way, along our strategic journeys. We can't avoid some of the risks and challenges. We have to be prepared and aware and then deal with them as they come. But now, before we go into that first topic, I'd like to just set the scene by telling you a story of the first people in South Africa, in the southern parts of Africa, where I am from. And those are the San Bushmen. And before we get there, I just want to say that just like the San Bushmen or the Khoisan, they are more likely to fail than succeed when they go out hunting. But also, if we look at all the literature and we look at the experiences out in the market, and this is pretty much true of almost all economies, developing and first world developed economies, that we seem to be more likely to fail as strategic leaders than to succeed. I actually put in my bio that Mr. Jeffrey has read out that one of my clients is the Steinhoff Group. They're a very large group listed in South Africa and Germany. I'm actually involved with a couple of their divisions. And they announced in the clothing retailer their best ever results. And that same day, a scandal erupted whereby they have lost something like 15 billion South African rands. That's about $1.2 billion in value in under a month. So does that mean they were successful? Yes, they were. Does it mean, well, at the moment, that is the likelihood. Now, that's a very dramatic situation, and I hope it has little to do with me helping advise them. I'm not at that board level, thankfully. But, you know, this is true, and I'm going to go into some stats that actually back this up. But if we come back to our San Bushmen, what we have is, as I say, they were the first people before the colonizers arrived in the bottom end of Africa. This was a people that lived by nomadic hunting. So they would move across the desert. They lived on the edges of the Kalahari Desert. And what they had was fairly primitive technology. So they had bows and arrows, but they had to live. And you can see from around them, they didn't live in lush forested areas. As I said, it was more in the areas of the Kalahari Bushveld and on the edges of the desert. So what you can see in this picture is a band of hunters. And let's think of them as one of our teams, with ourselves as the leader. What you have is they're looking for something. They're looking for the vision. They're looking to identify their strategic goals. Now, what they do is they can't afford to fail. If they fail, they don't eat. If they don't eat, they die. So what they would do is make sure that they were 100% clear on what their goals were, what their strategic objectives were. And how they did that is they would look into a herd, for instance, of giraffe, because they would hunt animals as big as giraffes, zebras, and so on, as well as small antelope. And they would spend a lot of time looking at, for instance, this small herd of giraffes. And they'd say, right, which one are we going to pick? Maybe we'll pick that one towards the left, not the baby one, but the one just behind it. It looks like an adolescent giraffe. It's probably not as aggressive or as strong possibly as some of those males. But now, how do we know when we hunt it that we're all hunting the same one? And then they would go and say, okay, well, I can see that it has a particular shape near its head. That's a bigger marking than the one next to it, because each giraffe has unique markings, so do zebras and so on. Maybe one of the tufted horns was slightly damaged or at a slight angle. So they would spend a lot of time making sure that they all were clear on their goal and that they all had the same goal in mind. And not just had the same goal in mind, but fully understood what it was that they wanted to achieve and aim for. Because they were a small band, they had to be focused. If along the way they got defocused and half of the group went after one animal and the other half went after the other one, well, they would fail. They would not achieve their objectives. And it's the same with us. So we need, as leaders, in order to be effective, we need to make sure that we and our teams and our whole organization are aimed at the same goals. So you see, what the Bushmen would do is they would hunt. They would go for that clear objective that they'd set. And as I said earlier, their technology wasn't necessarily the best. If we were planning a new business now and our business was to hunt giraffes, we would not use a bow and arrow. Now, what they did is they used what they had, and so they made their arrows very effective. They made a poison from certain insects. So what they would do is they would get as close as they could, close enough to shoot their arrows. Once they've hit their target, then a long process started, because it wasn't just a matter of identifying their target, getting close to it and ticking it off. What happened was large animals like this took quite some time to succumb to the technologies of the sand bushmen. They took time to die from the poison. So what had to happen was that the Bushmen had to spend a lot of time thereafter tracking them. And these people are known as some of the best trackers in the world. And in fact, many of them now work in our game reserves as trackers. But now when they came on a site like this, where the herd had scattered because of their attack, they had to make sure that they knew which of these was their quarry, which of these was their objectives. And so they would again come back, they would communicate, they would check, they would make sure they were on track, and then they would follow the tracks, and they would keep on coming back. So this picture is what they would do very often. They would keep coming back, making sure they're on the right track, making sure that they're still on path for their strategic objectives. So with that in mind, let's go back to that statement. You're more likely to fail than succeed. And we'll learn some of these lessons from these sand bushmen. There are many other lessons, amazingly, that one can learn from them, an amazing people and nation. But today we can't cover all of those. So let's have a look at this. These figures come from a Harvard Business Review study published in 2011. And there's a link at the bottom, and on my last page, I've given the full name and reference to it, so you can look in the detail yourself. 47% of executives said their company, and when I say company throughout this webinar today, you know, it applies whether I'm in a team fairly far down the hierarchy of the organization, or if I run a department, or if I run a division, the principles apply. It's not just for people and executives at the top of an organization leading a company. 47% of those leaders said their way of creating value is not well understood by their employees. So half of them said our people in our teams don't properly understand how we create value. 64% said that they had too many strategic priorities. They said that some of those were conflicting. And 56% said that for those priorities, they really struggled to find the ability to allocate sufficient resources and the right resources to their strategic priorities. And the bigger that set of growth initiatives, and remember 64% said they already had too many, the bigger that set, the harder it was to find the resources to allocate to those strategic projects. And 81% admitted that their strategic initiatives led to waste. At least some of them led to waste. And very significantly, in my view, is that the size of organization that was included in the survey did not influence the answer significantly. If you have a look at the sample, there were also, it was not just CEOs. As I said, this applies pretty much pervasively throughout organizations. Now, I'm not trying to say that this is true for every single organization, but on a properly statistically significant study, this is what came out. So let's have a look at the messages in this. So the first thing is, if our employees don't well understand how we create value, then obviously they can't understand properly their role in it. And if they don't understand their role in creating value, then how do they focus themselves? How do they know how to make choices? How do they, faced with different choices and different tasks and competing demands, pick the one or two or three that are going to create the most value? If we look at that 80-20 principle that I'm sure most of you, are, if not all, are familiar with, where we say that 20% of the things we do create 80% of the value, how do they know which of those 20%? So the first thing is we need to be clear. In other words, they're not entirely sure what it is that they should be doing. The next couple of points are really saying that the companies tend to go after too many things. So we're talking about wanting to grow revenue. We might also be talking about wanting to cut costs. We might also be talking about wanting to freeze headcount. We might be wanting to expand into other markets. And some of these tend to be conflicting. And if we have too many, we spread ourselves too thin. And in reality, when that happens, nothing of those opportunities or priorities, or very few of them, actually get enough attention and the right resources, and therefore they're pretty much set up for failure at the time. And that's what the last point really says. 81% of those executives, 4 out of 5, said that some of their initiatives at least lead to waste. So let's tie that back to the story of those sand bushmen. Well, they didn't say, let's go after that giraffe and a zebra. No, they picked very concise set of objectives, clearly defining those priorities. Each person in the team understood their role. Who's the tracker? Who's the person with the bow? Who's the best person, sighted person with the most experience to decide which of the animals that they're after is the best suited in terms of being able to be successfully hunted. So if each individual understands how they create the value, and we have a few concise, small set of strategic priorities, then it seems that we're at least on our way to a more successful strategic future. Now, I just want to qualify again what I said in the beginning. So what I'm talking about today is really the strategic side of the business, the growth initiatives, changing the business, not running the business. There's a saying that says the engines have to run. And that is, as I said, for each of us, we have our disciplines. In IT, we have to keep systems running. In the finance side, we have to keep financials on track. In customer-facing operations, we need to keep our customer care in order and logistics and so on. But what we're really talking about here is what about those strategic things where we want to take the business to a different level. Now, if we look at the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, that's really the type of thing that we're talking about. If we can look at that and devolve those kinds of big picture goals into the few concrete strategic priorities that each of us need to achieve, and we can define them clearly, then we can take our teams with us and our organizations with us. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. So the other side, the positive side that came out of this study is that the majority of the executives that reported having very few strategic priorities, and in fact, I've said 1 to 6 in the actual study, they had 2 different categories, 1 to 3 and 4 to 6. And actually the 1 to 3 strategic priorities, they had even higher chance of reporting success. But basically, with 6 or fewer strategic priorities across the organization, those companies were 3 times as likely to report above average performance. And in the study, that included things like increased profitability, lower staff turnover, higher shareholder value, and so on. And those that had many more strategic priorities or no list of, or clear list of strategic priorities at all, were only a third as likely to report that kind of performance. So having said that, let's have a look then at what these components might be. So the first of these 3 critical components, that is focus. And focus is that ability to know exactly which of those strategic priorities we are after, understanding exactly what they are. And the way we understand what they are generally is to understand how they will be measured. In other words, what will success look like? And if we know what success will look like, that helps us understand the nature of that key strategic priority. For us as leaders, we need to understand our role in achieving them, because if we're talking of a true strategic priority for the organization, or even our division, or our bigger area of responsibility, we generally aren't going to achieve those things on our own. Either we are part of a bigger team that's contributing, or we have multiple teams contributing below us. So what is our role in achieving them? How will they be measured? How will success be measured? And that helps us really properly define what those key strategic priorities are. Now, once we've got that, the next component, the next critical piece of strategic leadership is to be able to take that focus and communicate it to our teams. And I've called that align and mobilize. You see, there's many a gap between what we understand as a priority and what our people understand as priority. Effective communication is always a challenge. We are limited by having to use language. People have filters. We have past history. So the key is to be able to clearly and very concisely communicate those strategic objectives. What are the key results that we expect from our people? What is their contribution? So just the breakdown of what I spoke about under point 1 there. For each of our teams and our team members, how will their success be measured? What are their key results? What is their role? And then as the leader, particularly the more brave and large and stretch and innovative our objectives are, our priorities are, the more we need to look at our competencies, because as a well-known saying goes, what got us here won't get us there. And so if we've had real focused, solid competencies within our team that has led us to where we are today, we need to make sure that we have the right competencies to take us where we want to be. If we want to become a more digital company, and digital digital management is our focus, do we have the right people for digital? How many of our people will make that transition? Will we be able to find the resources to augment our team in order to do that? So it's one thing to have the objectives, but we need to make sure as leaders that we are able to actually achieve those objectives, and therefore we need to have the right team. And not just the right team, but we also need the right business processes, we need the right technology. But that's a topic for another day. But that's what we mean. In other words, are we actually able to succeed? And so once we can align and mobilize, that gets us out of the starting gates. That gets us into the first corner on the racetrack. But what gets us around the racetrack and what enables us to compete and what enables us to continually move ourselves more and more effectively towards achieving our goals is to be able to measure. And of course, all companies have measured things. We have operational dashboards, we have KPIs for people, we set personal development programs, but not so often are they directly linked, clearly, visibly linked directly to those strategic objectives. So what we need to do as strategic leaders and being effective is to be able to steer. So we need to have the right controls. We need to have the right metrics, those strategic metrics. And that's also, you know, a topic where we need to look at not only how are we progressing toward our actual objectives, are we 10% of the way, are we 60% of the way, but also how effective is our process of getting there. So our dashboard should measure our actual process as well. And we need the systems and processes, business processes underneath that. And we need to have clear, regular, and actionable indications of our progress. So as I said, we've always had KPIs and so on, but typically in many of the organizations that I've worked in over the years, and I'm pleased to say I see a rapid change now to a far more effective way of handling things like performance management and staff motivation and reward. But often KPIs were set, they were then maybe reviewed in the middle of the year and then again at the end of the year. But in the real nitty-gritty of day-to-day operations, those KPIs, those PDPs weren't necessarily focused on. And certainly they're not generally in many organizations that are in my experience, regularly updated. Because if we find that our dashboard shows us that we're not particularly on track, then are we able to actually change that? And now if we're measuring always after the fact, if our metrics only highlight what we would call lagging indicators, in other words, they show us what's happening, what has happened, not what is happening, then it's very difficult to tweak those things. Very difficult to give those small changes of direction that we need to get around the racetrack. It's very difficult to make sure that we're actually on the right track and not following the wrong set of footprints of the objective if we are the Sand Bushmen. So these are the three critical things. But what I've said on the previous couple of slides is that we have to have a small and focused set of strategic priorities. And now what I've started here is with point one of focus is it assumes that we have been given them. And so one of the key things is to say, well, if we aren't setting them ourselves, if we're not at the top of the organization, then we have to make sure that we're not being set up. And this might be a negotiation with our leaders, because maybe they've set 10 or 15 strategic priorities for us and for the organization. We need to come into some kind of contracting with them to make sure that we set ourselves up for success, that we're not set up for failure, so that we don't end up being in this group, that we rather end up being in this group. And there's a saying that I like to use quite often. which is to say, really, we can only start where we are, and we can use what we have, and we can only do what we can. So it might be that you are facing too many strategic priorities, or they're not clear enough, or the resources aren't available yet, or the measurements are not that clear. But start where you are. Work with what you have and do what you can to get to the subset of those priorities that will enable you to really excel, to really achieve them, and to move your team, your department, your division, your organization forward. Now, it's not as simplistic as that. It's not just 1, 2, 3, and off we go and we succeed. All of these things tend to have iterations and feedback loops. So if we find when we're steering that our dashboard shows us that we've got off track, well, we need to go and align again. We might have to go back to step 1 and say, well, hang on, are we on track? Did we understand it properly? We've set metrics. Are they the right metrics? We might just have to go back and say, well, have we created a clear understanding of those objectives with our people? So while we're steering and we get our indication, if we're on the racetrack, we know which gear we're in, we know the temperature, we know our fuel levels and all of these kinds of things. Do we have to then say, well, hang on, we've obviously communicated something not so clearly, and therefore we're kind of heading off, or we're going too fast, or we're going too slow. Let's go back. And we might have to go back to refocus, and we might even have to go back to our leadership and look at those strategic priorities again. So this, what you see in front of you now, for me, is our ongoing management system for strategic objectives, for strategic management, and for effective strategic leadership. And if we are able to master these concepts and put them in place, then it makes our job a lot simpler, and it helps us have structure, that we don't lose sight of the important under the pressure of the urgent. But now I've said there are 3 critical components, and I want to actually introduce a 4th. And the term inspire with integrity. You know, employee engagement has been a hot topic in management research and the management circles for a number of years now. And yet, if we go back 5 years and we go back 10 years into studies that were done then and studies that are done now, we find that levels of employee engagement are not significantly better. And that's with all the different types of models that we've used. Companies have decentralized from being central. Some have centralized again. We outsource things. We insource them again because that doesn't work so well. And then we outsource them again because we go through those cycles. We have devolved decision making. We have empowerment of teams. We bring in new approaches like lean and agile. And yet, overall, we seem not to have managed to crack the problem of employee engagement. So personally, I think one of the factors that isn't looked at enough is new generation. So the characteristics of the millennials and the post-millennials that are coming up now, they look for meaning much more than previous generations. They look for going to work because they want to be at work, not necessarily for the financial gain and so on, not for the security. Now that's an evolution. So I think where some of the interventions that we've tried in the last 5, 10, even longer years in organizations to increase engagement have actually worked, but we've also introduced this new layer into the organization that actually needs more and more personal focus and personal meaning out of their work in order to be engaged. But okay, that's an aside from me. So if we want to engage our people and we really want our focus, our aligning, our steering to really work, is we actually need to have willing followers. And I have to say that's another topic that I think needs more research. And there are studies coming out that I've seen more recently, particularly as you see the topic of neuroscience and neuro leadership coming more and more to the fore. and that is the topic of followership. We're always talking about leadership, but followership is actually quite important. So what does it mean? Well, if people are going to follow us as leaders, and they're going to follow us willingly, they're going to act proactively towards achieving these goals, towards adding value, towards bringing in innovations, and they're going to find a meaningful personal meaning and personal growth out of their work, then we as leaders need to inspire them. And it is a world that needs sustainability. It is a world that needs transformation. Again, looking at Vision 2030, that is such a radical and brave and ambitious plan. But it's marvelous because it can inspire people. It gives this amazing goal and future vision for people to see. And so we need to do that, again, whether we lead a large organization or a part of an organization, or even if we're an entrepreneur with our own small organization at this stage, we need to inspire with integrity. But inspirational leadership, charismatic leadership, without the ability to properly focus, to align and mobilize and steer, doesn't get us that far. It becomes more a cult of personality. But equally, those first three we can do. And we can do it in an autocratic way. We can do it in a way that doesn't foster the real team spirit. But if we add all four of those things together, then as leaders, we can be truly effective. And actually, if you look at it a different way, that fourth point covers everything. If we do all of those things with an aim for sustainability, with a focus on our people, then I think we can truly succeed. And that I'm always moved when I coach people and they understand this and they move off with this as their personal mission. So I see we're on 30 minutes now, so I have two more slides to show you. The first is turning knowing into doing. And in the preamble, one of the main topics was how to turn or how to close the knowing doing gap. Now that term came from a book, and again the link is on the last slide, called The Knowing Doing Gap, and it came out in 1999 and was one of the best and almost radical management textbooks at the time, and it still remains a well-respected and very powerful book. So if you haven't had the chance to read it, then I would really recommend it. So this is actually just one slide on this, and why I haven't spent a large part of this presentation on this is because if we do the preceding things well, and we put into place those four critical competencies ourselves, then actually we should have reduced tremendously the chance of having those knowing doing gaps. And at the top, I'm saying it's simple but not easy to turn knowing into doing, which means it's not rocket science. It's not, you know, something massively complicated, but it's not that easy. And so we have to apply these basic principles well, and we have to apply them consistently. And once again, if we fit them into what was on the previous slide, that model, then we should be able to do that effectively. So the first thing is put the why before how. If we want to inspire people, we need to give them the vision. If we want them to focus on something, they need to know why they're doing it. And allied to that is knowing comes from doing, and also teaching others how. So if we really can get a cohesive and collaborative culture going in our organizations and in our teams, then we have this virtuous feedback loop. People understand why, and then they start understanding how they'll do it. When they're actually doing it, they understand better why they're doing it and what they're doing, and that helps take them around that cycle of increasing knowledge and effectiveness. And we need to be agile. You know, we can plan and plan, we can get complicated, and we can have get consultants in to help us see the future, and we can do market research, but ultimately when we do stuff, it counts. And it's better in this current world to do stuff and fix it than to not do something until we think we've got the perfect plan. So agility is really key. Fear fosters knowing doing gaps. And as leaders, we need to take out fear. So how do we do that? Well, what causes fear in our team members or even in ourselves? It's not being clear on what it is that we're doing, on how we'll be measured, on whether we're actually doing it well, and whether we have the right support from our peers, the people who work for us and the people we work for. And so again, going back to those three steps on the previous slide, if we drive those and be clear and have the right kind of culture that supports that, and we inspire with integrity, we should reduce the fear, if not remove it completely. The next point, I think, is self-explanatory. We have to look at not having internal conflict. And I've seen a lot of companies where this is a big problem, but I'm seeing more and more as I work with companies that are really looking to grow successfully and move forward successfully, that they don't have too many internal politics. Measure only what matters. So I've spoken quite a bit about dashboards, and that we should measure not only our progress towards our strategic priorities and objectives, but also our process. But we need to just find that key set that matters. You know, we don't want to measure everything. We want to measure what really matters. We want the 20% of measures that show us 80% of what we need to know. And most importantly, that we measure what can help us turn knowledge into action. And the last point there that comes from the knowing doing gap is leading by example. What we do as leaders matter. Our people see how we spend our time and allocate resources. And so if we make a big play and we really go out boldly and explain to people why we're going for something and what their role is, all those good things I've mentioned, but we don't show that we're actually focused on the same things, or we don't provide the resources to achieve them, then it doesn't take long for our people to say, well, they weren't serious. I can't really trust them because they're not walking the talk. And so then they either become less engaged or they just focus on day-to-day operational stuff. So these are key things that we need to bear in mind. And again, I want to recommend that you read the book if you haven't read it yet, or read it again. That's what I've just recently done. And then finally, what I'd like to come to is this one-page model. So this is something we designed some time ago, and we've refined it over about 2 years with a lot of feedback from clients. And we use it in 2 specific ways with our clients and our clients themselves. So the first thing is to say this, if you look at these areas, the different sections tie back pretty much to those critical competencies. What's our focus? Do we have a clear strategic direction? And so we use this tool as a diagnostic, both for ourselves as leaders, but also for our team members. So if you can give a resounding yes to each of these questions, each of these statements, that's wonderful. And if each of your team members can give a resounding yes to each of these as well, that's even better. And in fact, if our leaders, the people we report into, also can give a resounding yes, then we're on the right track. The reality is that that's not generally the case. And so what we do is first use this as a diagnostic to say, well, where are we today? And of course, where it says no, then we know where we need to focus. And we've actually built ourselves an automated diagnostic tool. And feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to provide it. But you can also do it on paper. So once you've gone through all of these, and you pick out the ones between yourselves and your team members, and you could even do it as a 360 type assessment, then you know where to focus. So I'll give you some examples. I'm not going to go through every line. Do we have a clear and compelling mission and vision? And is it articulated into a few well-defined, clear strategic priorities that we can see how they support that mission and vision? And then do all team members understand their role in achieving those objectives? And if we have that, then would people agree that they share a common vision for where we are headed? If we go to the next section, do we have so the first part is saying, do we have that direction? The second part is saying, well, are we actually able to achieve it? So if you remember under the align and mobilize competency, I said that we have to actually have the right people, the right skills, the right infrastructure in order to be, and right culture for that matter, in order to achieve those objectives. So for instance, succession planning, is it part of strategic planning? So that we know when we are ready and we need people to take on new roles, that we have them in place. Are our reward structures aligned with strategic priorities in order to give sufficient impetus and motivation to people from a financial point of view? How much time do we spend every month purely on strategic priorities? As a leader, are we spending 20% of our time on strategic priorities and self-development that is focused on those priorities, not just general development? Now, 20% may not sound like a lot, but it's 1 day a week. And at the bottom, you can go through these, and I really would like invite you to see if this can add value, and if you have any feedback on how we might improve it, that would be wonderful. And at the bottom is really just saying, okay, do my team agree with my view? Does my leader agree with my view on these things? And in fact, do I? Am I answering some of them because I think that's what the answer should be? Am I being truly open and honest with myself? So I will leave you with that. And as I say, I hope it adds value to you as it has for many of other people. And then very quickly, and I apologize, Mr. Jaffrey, that I go 1 or 2 minutes past the 40. These are the risks and challenges. These things are going to happen. Number one, pseudo-alignment. We think we're aligned, and down the line we find, oh, but you said that, but I thought you meant that. No, I told you this, yes, but I thought you told me that. And that's just human nature and the limitations of language. Communicate is the key, but also we get that from our dashboards. So the better our metrics and our measures, and the more often we measure things, the more quickly we find where we are not actually truly aligned. The second thing is we get unexpected change. Life moves on. Things change while we're making other plans. So we need to measure, and then we need to analyze, see what it is that we are not achieving, and then we need to put in our improvements and be agile about it. Unexpected outcomes. That's just, again, human nature and the nature of the world, which is no matter how well we plan, sometimes things go differently. The fourth thing is operational pressures. And in all of this, I've been talking about having the strategic side of things. But of course, the engines need to run. Strategy shows us where we take the ship, but the engines need to keep running. And often we hit crises and they take our focus. So we need to be aware of that. And lastly, scarce resources. We always have not enough resources, no matter how many we have. So we need to be going back to our strategic priorities. We need to be saying we don't have these resources, and let's just manage the change so that it's not something we decide upon in the beginning of the year and then we just relentlessly go towards it, but that we keep ourselves aligned with the real world. And with that, I thank you very much for your time. Over to you, Mr. Jaffrey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mould, for a very, very interesting presentation. Now, folks, we are open for question and answers. So if you have any questions, you could either insert it in the question box, chat box, or you could equally raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the webinar console. Please click on it if you want to speak directly with Mr. Mould. So let me go to the question box. There are a few questions already posted. First one from Mr. Arif Hussain. How can we have people working for organization for something other than financial benefits?
Okay. So I don't think people work for other than financial benefits, but I think people, and if we look at various studies of what keeps employees engaged, it's things like Do I feel appreciated? Do I feel that my contribution is meaningful? Do I get personal meaning out of what I do on a day-to-day basis? Do I experience personal growth? So yes, it's people want financial benefit, but financial benefit is often not enough to get people to be fully engaged and in support of our where the organization wants them to take us.
Thank you very much. We have a caller who's raised a hand. One of our regular caller, Dr. Muhammad Faridi, Dr. Muhammad Rashad. Could you please introduce yourself once again and ask the question?
Hello, I'm Dr. Rashad here. I'm assistant professor at one of the universities in Kingdom, Saudi Arabia. And it's just a comment on Mr. Keith's presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's just like you have shown that slides of the Bushmen, and it comes back to that the organization, when we are having so much of technology orientation and digital transformation. So I think as leaders, we still go back to the basics and be simple. So, and it's more a playway kind of way of teaming your groups and understanding the conditions and the ability to exploit the resources. So I think moving forward, it's again coming back to the basics and just making technology as an enabler. Thank you very much, Mr. Ali, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Doctor, any supplementary comments, Mr. Mould, or you want me to go to the next question?
No, I would just endorse that entirely, and that is exactly what it is. We, as I said, we can only begin where we are, and we can only use what we have, and we can only do what we can do, and it's really about leadership, using things like technology. So exactly what Dr. Rashad has said, I agree entirely. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashad, for your comments. And let me move to another question we have from Mr. Tardisi Halalmar. The question is, dear speaker, how to build the lifelong learning organization in the knowledge economy era?
So that's a great question. Thank you for the question. So for me, what I find is that if we look at the era of coaching as a powerful adjunct to more traditional management development and leadership training, what I find is that there are really four key components. There's traditional management training. So, we might go and do an MBA. These are long-term generalist type programs. But more and more with the world that has such a quick rate of change, that we need to have also almost, let's say, just-in-time type of development that's focused on our key priorities. And then using coaching, both from having our own coaches, but also peer group coaching, the networking, if you like, of a peer group, so that we get the formal input of training, but that we also use each other as sounding boards, as advisors, as multiple resources, not just as colleagues in an operational environment, but to help ourselves grow, to develop the competencies and skills and knowledge that we need. So I think if we put all of those components together and make them accessible to our leaders, then we create focused, direct, just-in-time learning on an ongoing basis.
Thank you very much. Another short one. What do I do if there are already too many priorities?
Yeah, that's a good one. And that's generally the case. So again, and I'm going to say it probably many times, is we can only begin where we are. Now, the first thing is that I would do is to go and have a look, discuss with my leader which of those we can prioritize, to truly not just have a list of priorities, because they become watered down because we can't truly give our commitment to them. So have those discussions that says, well, you know, you've given us 12 of these, but what do we truly need to do? Let's pick 3 or 4 or 5 that we can focus on first. And let's make sure we've got detailed plans on those, and the others go on the back burner. That's really the only way, I think, to handle that. And then again, if we can't achieve that, well, you know, then I don't think we would really get very far strategically.
Yeah, another one from Mr. Hussain. What are the top 3 reasons the strategies fail?
Thanks, Mr. Hussain. Good question. So I think one of them is you know, the main sort of thrust of this discussion, which is not clearly enough defined in terms of strategic priorities and measurable, attainable objectives. I think another thing is that what you tend to find is that strategy is developed almost in the ivory tower. You know, it's on the in the board level or in the senior executive level, and then handed down, and doesn't include enough of the leaders further down to help shape those priorities and that strategy. And then often it's because I would think the third one is possibly that we are not agile enough to keep our strategy in tune with the real world. So we set strategy on the ground, day to day, we talk about being agile, but we don't tweak our strategy as we need to. We sometimes hang on to them too doggedly. Now, again, we don't want to change them too often, but we need to make sure that they're still valid.
Thank you very much. We have another caller raised a hand. We have Brother Ahmad Awad. Brother Ahmad Awad, if you can hear us, introduce yourself and ask.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Please.
Yes, okay. Ahmad Awad from Saudi Arabia, senior HR consultant. I would like firstly to thank Mr. Mould for his excellent presentation. It's very interesting to me to hear that a new generation are more and more seeking for personal meaning. They would like to see value for what they are doing. However, the contemporary organizations, in many cases based on economic approach, how we can resolve this issue. Leaders create really value in the organization context, and the new generation see that they're doing something valuable for themselves, for the community. I couldn't find this an easy task to be handled. So what Mr. Mould can advise leaders and organizations to create meaning for new generations and workers in general? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question, Mr. Ahmad. And yeah, I have to admit, I'm not sure that there's a ready answer to that, because it is a significant challenge. And I think not enough time and research has been put onto it. We find a lot of studies that tell us the characteristics of the new generation, but because the people in leadership positions are not from that generation, it's not that well understood, and perhaps not. You know, we need as leaders to actually learn more about that ourselves. So, if you look at what creates engagement, though, it's things like, for instance, has somebody had a discussion with me recently about my work content? Do I feel that I have friendly relationships, even friends within my immediate environment at the office? Do I feel that I'm a valued individual within the team, not just a worker? These are the types of things that generation finds, or those are the questions they would ask, and when they're answered positively, that would give them a sense of meaning. So it's those softer sort of things. But that, as I say, great question. Thank you, and it's a topic for deep introspection and discussion.
Thank you, Mould. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brother Ahmad, for a very interesting question. And I'm just looking at the clock as we are pressed on time. So let me take just one last question from Stuba Zia. The question is, being a leader, how can we keep our employees continuously motivated?
Again, great question. That and if it were easy, then we'd all have wonderfully happy employees and wonderfully successful organizations. So I would refer you back to that model that I had with the trees, and if we combine all four of those things, then I think that leads us to at least having an environment that's conducive to continuous motivation. In other words, if we inspire with integrity, and that has a chain all the way back to those strategic objectives, and we also take into account the personalities, the individual personalities within our team, and we can engage with them accordingly, then those are the types of things that's incumbent on us as leaders to do, to enable us to create motivation. But another thing is we mustn't take full ownership and responsibility for keeping our people motivated. We must set an environment where they can feel motivated themselves. And again, that's what employee engagement is all about. The more engaged our employees, the better, because it means they are motivated in themselves, intrinsic motivation, to come to work, to do their job well, to go above and beyond what's just the sort of contractual nature of their job. And if we can achieve that, then I think we truly have a motivated workforce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mould, for a very, very interesting presentation. I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for taking the time to deliver this live webinar. Any quick concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Well, firstly, I would just like to thank everybody that's attended, and once again, thank you and Madinah Institute for the opportunity. And I guess if there's a last point that I would leave is take those models, but just remember, you can only start where you are. You can only use what you have, and you can only do what you can, because otherwise what happens is we look at the gap between where we are and where we would hope to be, and we see a sometimes insurmountable challenge, and that takes our own motivation away, and then we end up taking our own focus off our strategic growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Quite an interesting presentation to self-analyze and reflect back as leaders. Just reminds me of a saying somebody asked Einstein, if you have 60 minutes to fix this world, what would you do? And he responded back, I will spend 55 minutes to identify the problem and 5 minutes to resolve it. So I think self-analysis is pretty good. But thank you very much once again. I really want to thank you on behalf of Mould for taking the time, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar and for your questions. We are recording it, so please stay tuned to webinar.mould.org to learn about our upcoming programs and webinars, and equally to access the recorded versions. With that note, I would like to end and conclude. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.